Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm looking at something you've probably got in your pocket, or if not, pretty close by, and that's money. And I'm exploring the ways in which humans make decisions in relation to it. Now, you don't need me to tell you that that is often bad news. Money can mess with our minds, and we've all seen examples of where poor decision-making with regard to money has led to bad outcomes. Many of my listeners, like me, have worked in the banking industry and will be very familiar with the dangers that money can pose. So, it's the perfect topic for the show. My guest is Vishal George. He's a behavioural scientist based in New Zealand. And full disclosure, Vishal and I both belong to a behavioural science practitioner network called Diversify. Details of that in the show notes. Vishal has just written a book called Money Mindset, Science-Based Stories to Rewire Your Money Beliefs, Goals and Habits. And I think what he has to say is really interesting. In the book, Vishal explores the fact that the way we behave when it comes to money comes from our beliefs about it, those we adopt from our families, socio-cultural environment and significant life events. They're almost, says Vishal, like scripts that are handed to us. Yet often we don't even know who the author is of those scripts. What if we could rewrite our own money story? He's not trying to change what we do with our money, rather he's trying to offer mindsets to change how we think about it. If we can become aware of why we do what we do with our money, we can make sure our behaviours with it are aligned with our priorities. I think that's super interesting, particularly at a time of year when there's probably a greater propensity to be spending it. So please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Vishal George on money mindsets. Vishal, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Kia ora, thanks for having me, Christian.
I'm so excited to speak to you because we know each other and we were part of a global behavioural science network called Diversify that we might come on and talk about. But for the benefit of my listeners that haven't come across you, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I like to describe myself as a serial experimenter, very much fond of sourdough baking, and I think that lends itself very well to the art of experimentation. And that complements my skill in a professional sense as a behavioral scientist. So I work with companies and organizations to support them with tools to think like a behavioral scientist. Sourdough is just a perfect complementary skill to enhance, I think, our skills as a behavioral scientist. I like to think of two styles of experimentation which you learn. One as a behavioral scientist of being very diligent with your experiment and running a robust scientific trial with no flaws. And with baking, you have constraints in place. You have to work with what flour you have. You get your results very quickly. With behavioral science experiments, you sometimes have to wait for a good 6 months. But with baking bread, you sometimes land up with a frisbee loaf, which goes into the compost in less than 24 hours. And you have to restart. And it's a very humbling experience and has taught me a lot about how I maybe rethink about behavioral science too.
Tell us a little bit about the work that you do. What kinds of problems are you helping people to solve?
So I largely work in the space of helping teams set up experiments. One is to explore what tools from psychology can help us design more behaviorally informed tests. For example, I work with a large bank in New Zealand, and we look at how do we encourage people to save up to have at least $1,000 savings in their bank account. And I then go into what does the literature tell us? What are insights which we can draw from other case studies? What's worked in other contexts? And we take all of that together and with a lot of humility, we test it out, much like the frisbee, which I get with a sourdough loaf ever so often. A seemingly great strategy can really have not very great results. And I think that's where the humility plays a big role in identifying scientifically what strategies are most likely to work in a very specific context for a client in a client's environment. So in a nutshell, that's maybe the process of evidence-informed insights and testing with humility.
And I love that. I love that with humility thing, because in the times I've spoken to you, that comes across very strongly. Is that you are someone who, you have a lot of knowledge, but there's also kind of, I don't really know, we need to try things out, and a very, almost take this the right way, but a very childlike sense of exploration and looking at things and kind of questioning and wondering what will work. And so I love this idea that's combined with humility, because often children have no fear and they run around and do things. And you do have that willingness to kind of open things. And some of the projects I've heard you talking about require that level of creativity and open mindedness. And yeah, I love that humility that underpins everything you do, which is kind of to say, well, I don't really know.
Yeah, something which I've been embracing more and more is accepting failure. A mountain which I've been trying to summit a few times in New Zealand, Mount Taranaki. I've made 3 attempts, and the first time we had really a snowstorm come in, and we were in the mountain hut, and I was glad to make it out of the mountain alive. The second time, we didn't even start to summit the mountain, bad weather again. The third time, we got really close and the wind started picking up and it started getting a bit uncomfortable. And I was very, very glad to quit at that stage. I know a lot of ego can come into the picture when it comes to a mountain summit. And I've started embracing that side of, yeah, I have this quest to still do and still look forward to, and also recognizing what are my limitations. To what extent is this comfortable? To what extent is this taking me away? And I think that's Annie Duke summarizes it really well in her book Quit. We just overvalue this whole notion of grit and sticking with things. Sometimes we stick with a trial, we stick with a project because there are lots of egos involved in completing it and proving to the world that it works. But I think we should also take pride in quitting. There's a lot to learn from that lesson.
I love that. And of course, one thing you didn't quit at this year, Vishal, was your book, which came out. And so, firstly, let me say congratulations, because I know from personal experience, right, that those things don't just appear. They require a ton of effort. And so there's something you stuck at. But tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write it.
Thanks. Yeah, that did take a lot of perseverance. So sometimes grit does play a big role in doing those small things over time. That perseverance may have been drawn from something I had observed working both with banks and credit card companies and a few fintechs, is the forces that move us away from good financial behaviors are starting to outweigh the forces which enable us or support us to participate in good financial behaviors. So, if we think of some of the technological changes and shifts we've seen over time, there's contactless payments. We can just tap and pay our cards, and you and I know the psychology of pain of paying. If we really have to part away with physical cash, it tends to hurt us much more. If we use a contactless payment, it doesn't hurt us that much, and we're far more likely to pay. Similarly, Amazon's been experimenting with just walk out technology. So you can literally walk out the store without having to pay a cent, which means that we're going to be far less likely to be aware about our savings. We're going to be far more encouraged to spend. I think there's an interesting insight when we look at the history of money. Typically, money was a very visible, savings was very visible. So we could see how much savings someone had accumulated by looking at the amount of cattle they had. So we saved in sheep and cow. And right now, savings are invisible, tucked away in a bank account, maybe in the Cayman Islands or in a Bitcoin wallet somewhere. We have absolutely no idea how much our neighbors are saving. It's even more awkward to have that conversation walking up to a brother-in-law and ask how much savings they have in their bank account. It makes very unpleasant dinner conversation. But what's very visible is what car someone pulls out of their driveway. That's very visible. How many people are at a busy cafe having an avocado toast, lazy Sunday brunch that's super visible to us? And I was thinking about what ways, what mindsets can be introduced, what language and tools from behavioral science can support us in rebalancing some of the shifts which are taking place. And that's been a big inspiration for me to write the book Money Mindsets.
So really, you're talking about how 21st century humans have it much harder when it comes to looking at money than their predecessors. And so I guess if I looked at what I get out of the book, it was really highlighting that and to say, look, here's some stories. And I love the fact that storytelling was involved to help you think about that so that I guess we can all be slightly better at it.
Yes, and more curious with our money too. I think there's it's quite a taboo topic, and something which I've been trying to get better at is asking people in the I go to the sauna quite often, 2 or 3 times a week, and I go around serving the sauna and ask people how much money they make. And there's this awkward moment of silence when I first ask the question. People look, they pause, and then they start opening up. And it's not just money which comes up in the conversation, it's about the cost of living crisis, it's about inflation, it's about gender inequality, and it's the emotions which we have of safety and security, the housing crisis. A lot of people are living in the rental market, which is not easy, and there's a power imbalance between landlords and tenants. And money is almost, I think, a doorway to talking about some of our other feelings, some of our other emotions. I try to make the case, and I'm believing this more and more myself, that our needs, say our needs for financial security and stability, is not just a need for safety and security financially. It's also an emotional need for safety and security. And I think money is just like this amazing doorway which opens up all these other conversations, which we're not really aware of in our conscious memory.
And I love this idea of the way you describe it, and I'm absolutely convinced that if I tried to do this, I would struggle to start with, and I would block myself from doing it, which is kind of your point, right? Whereas you've got used to having that conversation. I mean, it is a massive taboo, and I love the fact that you talk about the sauna because, in a way, that's a location where people are either entirely or almost naked, and so you're stripping away a lot of the other things that might be there. So I wonder whether, I mean, that context might make it easier.
Yeah, and the heat too. It gets real hot in the sauna. Things come up. I think it encourages. No one can. You're in a closed, confined space. So when I ask someone how much money they make, they can't just look the other direction or get up and walk away. It's sort of like an elevator, but you're trapped for a longer period of time. Um, and I think the heat allows things surface out in the heat. We know these physiological changes can have an impact on our psychology and what's in our mind. It's very fertile ground for conversation. I think one of the conversations which have opened up in the sauna, and something which I really try to highlight in my book too, is um, I did touch upon the power imbalance which exists. And I think there's a power imbalance which also exists in terms of putting too much onus on the individual to save money and do better. And I think there's a lot which banks and fintechs and our governments can do to introduce systems. I have a chapter titled Nudge the System, and it's all about the system level changes which we can introduce. And if you love me, I have a quote from James Clear, which I got with me, which I think summarizes it quite well. The relevance of systems. You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And that's James Clear has adapted that from someone else who's probably adapted that from someone else. But the point being that we might have these amazing wants and needs and desires, but if we don't have the right systems in place, we're very unlikely to do the right behaviors.
The way you're talking is the system that we have, both societally, but also the way we individually manage and encourage to manage our money, isn't encouraging the sorts of outcomes you're looking for. It makes it too easy to spend money. It makes it a little bit harder to save money. We don't have full sense of control over what's going on. And so really what you're talking about, to sort of speak my language, is some form of it's almost intervention. So you can call it behavioral interventions, but you're in the zone of sort of saying, well, we need to step in here. Society needs to do something. And that points us, I guess, in financial services naturally towards thinking about this as something that needs regulating.
Yeah, one of the good examples that I've seen, it's as you spend money, you save money automatically. So an example of that is a bank in New Zealand has a program called Save the Change. So every time you go out to buy your takeaway coffee or you buy your lunch at a cafe, you might be encouraged to buy lunch, seeing others are buying lunch, and you might spend $9 in your on your lunch, and the $1 gets rounded up, and it goes straight from your current account to your savings account. And that's a good example of a system which has been introduced, which supports savings behaviors, because we know as behavioral scientists we all have the best intentions, but if the systems aren't in place to make it easy for us to do so, to make it automatic for us to do so, we're unlikely to do it. And I think the potential is huge for innovation, both in the banking and the fintech space, to introduce such systems to encourage us to nudge us towards doing better behaviors. And I think it works at the individual level too. It's very hard to design a universal system that will work for everyone. We all have our individual needs, wants, and desires. We all have different personalities. And I can see some unintended consequences if we have financial institutions pushing us towards a direction which we may not be comfortable with. And I think there's room for us to start designing our individual level systems, automations, if you'd like, in terms of instructing whether your bank should be rounding it up to $10 or not touching it, or rounding it up to $20. And that's a very individual level choice. Also, where that money goes, does it go just to your savings account? Does it get invested into a low cost ETF? Apologies for the jargon. But I think there's different levels of sophistication which you might want to introduce, or simplicity of not wanting to save at all. And that's, I think, the space for us to be a little bit more aware of what systems can we design for ourselves alongside with the innovation banks and fintechs can introduce.
And that's interesting because historically, go way, way back, banking was a very, very personal product where the bank manager knew who you were. In fact, held great swathe over your life because they could determine, what lots of things that were, and then it became a bit more commoditized, where sort of products got rolled out across the piece, and often people were given the wrong product. And I love this idea of you've kind of come full circle, because the very tech that causes some of these problems you talk about is exactly what you're pointing towards, to be able to offer the solution. And therefore, we can actually offer very, very customizable product pretty easily if in a digital environment. And of course, you've also got the data that allows organizations to think about what those products might look like. So it's not even just I can have a free choice, but that can be a much more informed choice based on my past performance and my patterns of expenditure and behavior.
Yeah, that's a great point you introduce. And I think something which is missing from the puzzle is that banks do have a lot of good and rich data about us. They know where we spend money, they know our favorite cafes, they know what things bring us joy. Hopefully, my bank might know that going to the sauna and having awkward conversations gives me joy, and it's quite a regular behavior for me. And I think as custodians of this rich data set, you can either use this data to sell more products and services that either I don't need, or you can design very tailored solutions based on my needs as an individual. I think there's a responsibility as a custodian of this data. You can either sit with this data and do nothing. We use language and as behavioral scientists as of choice architecture. So how you design and present information influences the choices we make today. And there's no neutral way of designing things. So if you don't use this data in any way, you are designing allowing the forces such as contactless payment to push people in one direction. Or you could be very intentional in how you use this data, how you support your customers' long-term financial well-being, and how you move them along that direction based on this data which you have about customers.
And I love that idea, and I think it's a really, really important one to stress. This concept, I get this quite a bit where people say, "Well, how do you know your behavioural stuff is, demonstrates to me it's a good thing?" As if to say that what is already happening is neutral, and therefore anything that you bring in that's new is going to be somehow potentially evil. And I think you're really right to raise that point because, as you say, banks are sitting on a ton of data which, if deployed in the right way, and you're right, they know how to deploy it to sell us products. So clearly, there's an awareness the data exists, there's an awareness of the potential of it. So I love this idea of basically saying, look, you're already making a call on this. So actually, it's not a case of suddenly having to start making a call. You're making a conscious decision. And it must be a conscious decision because some of the other things you do. So I love that positive framing because I think then that makes it a lot easier to, pun intended, nudge them in the right direction because this isn't a big shift. This is just looking at deploying what you already deploy in a different context that's actually beneficial to the customer.
Yes, totally. And we need to consider what the default world is like and in which direction are we moving things towards in the default world. So, one way of thinking of this is if we don't do anything, where do we project this customer's bank balance to move towards or their savings to move towards? And if we do intervene, in which direction will they move towards? And talk to customers, I think. Something which we've missed out in the age of digital banking is there's very little human to human interaction. We're interacting with, so banks are interacting with customers through a mobile app. Um, and what gets missed out in that conversation is the stories of customers and quite often mislabeling too. Something which I touch upon in the book is the language of deficit framing. So we quite often define customers as a low socioeconomic group set of customers or at-risk customers or vulnerable customers. But people don't wear these labels in their head. Like people aren't. These aren't the labels which people carry with them. These are labels that we are putting on people. And a more helpful way of looking at it is with the asset framing lens. That's a term coined by Trabian Shorters, who does community work for empowering communities to improve their financial well-being, is to really start defining people by their dreams and aspirations. What does good look like for a customer um, versus this deficit framing of at-risk customers. And by doing so, by looking at customers for their strengths and their aspirations, you're telling a better story of who they really are and who they want to be.
I love that because one of the things that really winds me up is, those surveys you get where you have to tick your age range, or they ask you to tick your age range. And I hate those because one is it always means that I think birthdays ending in a 5 are much more significant than birthdays ending in a 0, because I know that the rest of the world has decided the moment you tick over 35, 45, 55, you're in this new bracket and you're suddenly treated, you've got older and you're expected to listen to different radio stations and to behave differently. And I've always found that really annoying. Now that's something that is, it's harmless in the scheme of things, right? It doesn't make any difference. It's not telling me how to behave. But I've often thought that for me is indicative of this kind of classification that, I don't suddenly change on my 44th birthday into my 45th, suddenly become a whole new person. And it's that characterization that's imposed on me from outside. So I love this idea of thinking aspirationally. Because I think it's, if we do that, all we're doing is we're pigeonholing people, which is not helpful on any number. I mean, it feels wrong on a human level, but it's not good from a societal perspective. It's not good for helping social mobility, giving people aspirations, all those sorts of things. So I love this idea of what you're doing there in a very simple act of reframing is just saying, let's look at the dynamics and the challenge slightly differently. And so rather than taking what we presume you are, let's have a conversation about what you would like to be and where you'd like to go. And I think we know from other contexts, whether that's dieting or whether that's career aspirations, that people do look ahead, and we do have the capabilities to imagine things. That's what gets you climbing up the mountain, right? Otherwise, you're classified as the guy that can't climb up the mountain, right? Which is clearly nonsense. And so I love it because it's a simple behavioral flip, but I think it just has a massively disproportionate impact relative to the effort required to get there.
Yeah, definitely. And it applies in many, many different contexts, as you alluded to. I know we're very tempted to doing personas based on age and demographics, which are very obvious to us, which are apparent to us. Someone might look old and someone might look of a certain gender, and we put them in a bucket and we expect them to behave in a certain way. And of course, the data will tell us a story we want it to tell us. It will point towards some difference when we cluster people on these demographics which are visible to us. And I think there's this whole invisible set of demographics, maybe behavioral personas, if you'd like. They've done this work with COVID vaccinations and looking at who are the people, what are the barriers in place which are motivating someone not to get vaccinated, and by grouping people by the barriers versus some made up demographic, you're able to really address those barriers. You're really able to, in some cases, realize that, okay, for this set of people, it's not for them. They're very clear about their voice. And let's stop wasting our time trying to convince this demographic, which doesn't want to be convinced. And let's spend our time and effort with someone who's a little uncertain about the efficacy of the vaccine. That may be a better group to speak to and encourage. And it works in many, many different contexts. Though I think personas can be really butchered by some practitioners, but I think it can also be done well by looking at what are people's psychological barriers, what are people's dreams, what are people's aspirations.
And you've reminded me of the kind of marketing I'm sure you get on LinkedIn as well from people, where it's a sort of, I've just quickly read the job title and who you are and where you live, and I will make a ton of presumptions about you. And you get this email that is about as untargeted as it could be. And often, even if the product is of interest to me, I'm like, go away, right? You have already misclassified me. And so I love this idea of you're taking something that we all viscerally understand, right? Somebody coming with the wrong approach, like trying to interest in something we have no interest in, or sort of telling us about who we are. That feels incredibly personal. And so I love this idea of you saying, well, let's be a bit more intelligent about it. And let's not, it's not for us to decide who people are. It's let's try and find out and be much more intelligent about it. And then we're more likely to get through to them. And that's a very, very basic fact that we all, if you go and talk to, I don't know, a cricket fan about football, right? Okay, it's a sport technically, so they ought to have some interest in competitive sports, but you're not likely to resonate. And so we understand that point. But I think it's really interesting when you're talking about contexts like financial services, where you would think this stuff would be understood better than it is, and you think moves would have been made. And yet, my suspicion is they're probably also targeting the stuff they're already doing along the lines that you suggest. And so, what I guess you're helping them to do is one is you could say, well, this will just help them to do what they do already a lot better, but also it brings in this new lens, all of which is much more customer friendly and customer centric. And so, given these businesses are talking about being customer friendly, customer centric, there's greater competition out there. You'd think this would be something that would be picked up, but in my experience, it's not. And so I love the fact that you're working with these organizations and pointing out something that I think is relatively simple, which isn't going to go against the flow of what they're trying to do already. It's just going to help them be better at both the commercial aspects, but also the societal aspects, which in turn will then feed the commercial bit.
Yes, absolutely. And thinking of the categories which we form. The brain is a categorization machine. Like there's no stopping that process. And in some cases, it serves us really well. So we know how much money which we're going to spend on rent the next month. That's not going to be a big puzzle to us, hopefully. Um, and it's very helpful to have a category in that place to be able to account, okay, I'm going to spend X amount of dollars in rent, and that gives me certainty, that gives me clarity. And then there's a set of categories which are not easy to classify. These are the unexpected expenses or the one-time expenses. I narrate the story of Kaya in my book, and Kaya goes out. She's trying to save money and get better at saving money. She's quite determined to do it. She has all the right motivation, and she believes she's a very strong, independent person, and she has lots of self-control. What happens is her TV breaks down one month, and this is a month where she was hoping to save money, and she realizes this has happened after 5 years, and she realizes that she has to replace her TV. She goes to the store and she asks for a replacement TV. She wants the exact same TV, but the salesperson convinces her that that TV is going to be outdated in a couple of months, so she needs to upgrade her TV, and she gets convinced. The same week, her favorite band is playing in town. They visit her city once in 20 years. It's quite a rare occasion. So she decides like she's going to get tickets for this one time, and even more so, she gets a pop-up message for front row seats at a discount, not too much more. So she decides to spend that money. And the next week is her and her partner's 10-year wedding anniversary. And that's a once in a lifetime event that doesn't happen very often. So she decides to splurge on getting a cocktail bar set up. And the trend which emerges from this story is that we have a very categorized expenses, such as rent. And then we have this huge category of unexpected one-time expenses, which are very hard to categorize, but which also means that we're going to spend more than we expected. And it's a good rule of thumb to account for some of these unexpected expenses, because if we look at a long period of time, they're far more expected than we think or would like to believe.
And you mentioned her as an example. So the structure of the book is you're telling stories about people that really allow us to understand these things. So that was just one illustration of the way the structure of the book works. What made you decide to do it that way?
Great question. I had started writing the book and over a period of time, and I put the science behind it. So lots of it from neuroscience, psychology, some insights from behavioral economics and anthropology and adjacent fields. And if I tell any of these these insights to my friends, it goes straight over their head. I'd probably be asked to leave the sauna if I started a story with the psychological pain of paying. But if you start something with a story, it's more likely to stick because we see ourselves as characters in these stories. We empathize with the characters in these stories far more. And then we open ourselves to curiosity. We want to open ourselves to how does science work? Why was the first character in the book Rita? Why was Rita so curious about going on vacation with her family? How did she retain this curiosity about money? And we're far more likely to remember stories with a little bit of science wrapped around it. I think the science gives us some mechanisms, gives us some tools to understand how it might transfer to our own lives. But the stories, in the end of the day, is what we remember. So front and center, and the subtitle of the book is Science-Based Stories. And I think that works much better than science-based facts.
And I have to say, thoroughly enjoyable, thoroughly engaging, and I kind of recognised dynamics of myself there. But to start the book off, you even put yourself in the frame, and there's a great little story that you tell, which opened my eyes. I was like, oh, because I wasn't expecting the detail of it, but it was super engaging. Can you just give us a sort of quick synopsis of that? Because this is you from a very young age.
Yes, it's quite funny because I started a book talking about other people's stories, and these stories were collected from people I had interviewed. And I had finished writing the book, and I had written a very philosophical introduction up front. And what I realized was there's some work I need to do on myself out here. I've shared vulnerable stories with friends and many others who have interviewed, and I need to be a little vulnerable out here. So I started the book with sharing. I had to dig deep for this, and the story just surfaced. This was when I was 11 years old, and I had started a business with a few of my friends. We were selling essentially, started selling posters, these music band posters and football posters, and we sell it at an incredible premium. We figured out a gap in the market, and we sold it at a premium. And what we realized at that stage was this was pre Google and pre Amazon. What we realized is we had a very good understanding of what other students wanted. So beyond posters, we realized that there was a market for football jerseys at the time. I had a good source for that. We realized that there was a big market for fountain pens, which were trendy back then, presumably wouldn't work in today's.
I don't know. Everything comes back though. So if you've still got some left, might be worth looking at.
The business just did so well as there was nothing left. Everything sold out very quickly. We had like good market insights. We had runners on the ground. We had old school chat forums, which I didn't know the concept of direct marketing or digital marketing, but we had people on chat forums like ICQ and MSN asking people if there was a demand for these things. So we really were testing things out. And in a very short period of time, I made more money than I've ever seen. I don't think I've made that much money as an adult too, accounting for inflation. And we were sitting with just like piles of cash. And as an 11-year-old, there's not so much you can buy. I had all my needs taken care of at home. I had my rent paid. So I used to like wearing hats, and I got about 30 hats. So I had a hat for each day of the month. So there was nothing left in that department. I was a Man United fan at the time, and I had their home and away kits for the last few years. There was nothing else to cover on that. Every single game on PlayStation, I had that. I also looked at generosity. There was maybe a little bit of a social status game and a little bit of feel-good factor and giving, which I derived from doing this experiment of when I was at the school cafeteria, I would pay a little bit extra money so that the next person gets a free item. And now it's quite trendy on Instagram, the whole pay it forward concept. But I used to get a big kick out of just like, let's surprise the next kid and see their reaction, almost like as a social science experiment, and also the feel good from it of this anonymous gifting culture. Something which did happen eventually as my hustle got busted. It turns out that one of my biggest buyers was stealing money from his parents to fund my operation, and I had to show up with. I started the book with this. I was literally standing outside the principal's office with like a mountain of cash in my hand, trying to return it. And it's funny, I had never questioned the ethics and values of running a business. My father was a businessman, and I was maybe trained to look at how I can maximize my profit like that. And that moment of shame that I had standing outside the principal's office with a pile of cash is that emotion has something which has not left me since. Even today, as I run a small business, the idea of making too much money makes me feel shameful. And I have that emotional relationship with money, which I acknowledge. I don't necessarily want to change, but I have to live with the fact that I do need to pay my rent and I do need to meet my costs. Um, and if I try to make too much money, if I try to get too rich too soon, I'm not very comfortable with that. And that's been a realization I had through narrating the story and the learning I had about myself, which I found very encouraging with sharing to readers as well.
No, I really enjoyed it, not because I was enjoying your pain and your experience, but I thought it was like a great story because one can imagine it happening, right? It's not implausible, and I think it really points towards what you do now. And so that experience, I think, really sets the tone for how you were looking at the world. And I love the fact that it wasn't, because a lot of these books are designed to advise you how to think about the world. It's often done from a perspective of, I'm going to tell you the way the world is. My years of experience have taught me blah. Right. And this, I think, plays into the humility thing you talk about, which is I'm going to put myself out there as having not done everything correctly to start with and having some issues. And, you, in a way, if you ask the average person, you'd say you had a nice problem with money because there's the opposite end of the spectrum where there isn't any. And having some is logically better than not having any. But there's a degree, I think, of sort of recognizing that it poses problems and that you've had to think about those things and that they're there. So I thought it was a really powerful way to almost point not just to the book, but my sense to a lot of the work that you do as well.
Thank you, Christian. That's very kind of you to say. I'm going to soak in that compliment. I do believe that it opens up our conversation about emotions, not just, I think money is a doorway to talking about some of our emotions, which is quite suppressed. I know males may do that. I was at a West Ham game when I lived in London, and within a few minutes, I was quite surprised. Within a few minutes, the person next to me, I think the striker may have missed the goal, had broken the seat in front of me and got kicked out of the stadium. And it was only 3 minutes to the game. There's 90 minutes, a 90-minute game. And I just imagined this person having a lot of emotions that they weren't able to process, and that the striker missing the goal had brought and surfaced up some of those emotions. And I think we carry these things in many other facets of life. We may get really, really almost disproportionately upset with an email which we receive. Quite often it's an unprocessed memory. It could be something from our early childhood. It could be something from earlier on in the day. And I think it's a helpful reflection point of not just looking at what's going on in our immediate environment, but what are parts of our past that we've not addressed and what we would like to do differently. I've definitely acknowledged the emotions that I carry, some of them, and I'm still learning some which haven't surfaced yet, in trying to get better at aligning the work which I do with more purpose. Something which I talk about in the book is spending our money with more purpose and intention. And I think that extends to living our life with more intention and more purpose. Quite often we're carrying narratives from the past of what good looks like. But I think we do have an opportunity to pause and reflect on what does a good, rich life look like to us? And then how do we get there? What are the steps we can take to moving towards that good life?
Knowing you and reading between the lines, I mean, it strikes me that a lot of these things drive the business that you run. And I think what's interesting is it's possible to run a behavioral science-led business that is very almost exploitative of clients, where you come in and sort of promise the earth. And we've seen people in both the academic space and the business space effectively bring the discipline into disrepute. And you strike me as being somebody that's at the opposite end of the spectrum, where there would be a great amount of honesty around stuff you couldn't do. There would be not engaging with clients that you didn't want to work with. And so really the strategy of the work that you do, the people that you'll engage with, it seems to me that you're very thoughtful around that. And a lot of that comes from what you've just been talking about.
I try. Yes. Thank you. And thank you for, again, another massive compliment. I do appreciate that recognition, which I also think, and that's been a realization that has been like a human need for me, is why I do what I do, is being recognized for doing more good work. And that motivates me to do more good work. I think quite often we look at recognition as, well, I don't want to be recognized, I'm doing it for this other purpose. But I think recognizing that where does a human need come from has been a helpful motivation for me. I've tried to set up the business very intentionally to focus on 3 strands of work. So social impact work which improves people's financial well-being, and work on sustainability. So that's been a good way of me to filter whether a project is a good fit for me, or a project that I should stay away from. The second element, which is something which I am also working on, something which I am passionate about, is I've spent a lot of time doing really good research, which ends up in someone's hard disk or cloud, sitting somewhere, which the world doesn't get to see. So something which I am exploring as a work in progress is, as practitioners and as behavioral scientists, what if we set the default as any work which gets done at a very early stage of the project is public, open source information? So if I do awesome work with a fintech company, for example, one of the cases which came out, which I highlight in the book, is a fintech company which has experimented with savings. So savings of $150 per day versus, $150 per month versus $5 per day. It's about the same amount, but if you frame it as $5 per day, it sounds like a no-brainer. It's just the cost of a flat white out here. It's not as intimidating. But if you tell someone to set aside $150 a month, that sounds like a far bigger amount that it is, and it puts off people from saving money. And that so framing it as $5 a day leads to 4 times the number of people who enroll into automatic savings, and that's an amazing system which can really help a lot of people. And I think it can help people beyond that one fintech or beyond that one bank. That learnings could be shared across banks and fintechs in the country, across the globe. Others can experiment with it and see if it supports their customers. And having a system like that in place of default open source sharing of insights it's a win-win situation where everyone's able to uplift their financial well-being. So I try to think a little bit deeper beyond just the immediate impact that a single project can have, to what kind of collective impact can we have as practitioners. And I think we do that too in some form with our collaboration in the Diversify network. We're all doing amazing things in different parts of the world, and we can learn from each other's stories and experience to uplift not just all of us, but also others in the field who are inspired by the work which we do.
And I think one of the things I find fascinating about hearing about what you do is, on the one hand, there's that basic behavioral thing, is we're all human. And so we're all equipped with the same OS, and yet we all have these differences. And I think the fascinating thing about when I hear about what you're doing is we speak the same language, and yet you're in a very different part of the world. And so plenty of the things that you're looking at you might well come up with a completely different solution to the one that I would based in Europe. And so this idea of having different perspectives on things, I think is super helpful. And I love it when I'm shocked by things, because in the same way that, if we were just blundering through life and it was kind of like everything was predictable and samey, right, that would be nice and simple on one level, but it would actually be really tedious on another. And so I love the idea when you come with a left field thing where I'm just thinking, actually, that's super interesting and that's different. And that comes purely because you're working in a different environment, looking at different things. And so I think there's a real richness there about just hearing other people's experiences. And I love this idea, as you were talking, I love this idea of kind of open source findings, because typically the only time we get to find out what people are up to is either when they're showing off. So this is sort of marketing or credentials where, we can see ad campaigns that have been clever and we can see clever interventions that are visual, but actually in the digital space, we can't necessarily see all those things. And so I like this idea of saying, well, hold on a minute, you're prepared to talk about it in certain contexts. Why not talk about it more generally? And we'd all benefit. And so the glimpses I have of your world, I would love to see much more, because I think that would help us. Because, where do I get my inspirations from with the clients I work with? Well, it's answer stuff that I've seen before, stuff that they've come up with. And sure, we can go and look for inspiration in interesting places, but wouldn't it be better to have that more broadly there for the sake of society? And I think particularly when you're talking about some things that have a social good, I think that's an incredibly powerful. Even if it's something that you couldn't or wouldn't do in your space for good reason, at least hearing somebody else's ideas will provoke some creative thoughts, and it gives you something to work with. And I love that, because I think we're really in the need to be. We do need to be innovative and think differently, because part of the reason, back to the banking conversation, part of the reason we have the problems we have nowadays is there's a lot of sort of, the legacy thinking, and we haven't shifted to match things. And so we've got structures in place that were possibly valid once upon a time. I don't always know, but they don't necessarily reflect the realities of nowadays. And so I think the onus is on us in the behavioral space is to really be very creative in what we do. Well, how do we increase that? Well, the answer is we have more things to look at so that we can be inspired to think different.
Yes, very, very well put. And that made me reflect on the role of context on how we think. And I had an immense sense of gratitude of the context in New Zealand just being a very safe environment for testing. It's a very calm and relaxed environment. I spend a lot of time doing different practices. I'm fond of yoga and meditation, and I have time and space to do that here in a very peaceful space, a very peaceful environment. I also have family back in India, and I find it very hard to just meditate even for a few minutes in the day with all the traffic in a big city in India. And I think it's an acknowledgement of the impact of context and our environment on who we are as people. And I think that variance in context also allows us to have very different experiences in how we see the world and how we identify certain gaps. And I think it opens up the opportunity of sharing and collaboration too. So I was sitting with an immense amount of gratitude for the place I'm in, which allows me to do some of the things that I do. I did have a question for you, Christian. Something which I've been reflecting on, and I thought you might have a good insight on this. So I'm a big believer in applying behavioral science on ourselves. So at least my opinion or my worldview is, if we can't change our own behaviors, we have little hope of changing
I'd agree with that.
someone else's. And I was thinking about how that might apply in other contexts. And I was thinking about a doctor, for example, a GP. And my question was, like, should you trust your GP if your GP doesn't get good sleep at night, or sleeps less than 4 to 6 hours? How do you think about that?
I think it's interesting. I think it depends on what you think the function of the GP is, right? Because I've been reflecting on propensity to go to the doctor, and sort of who doesn't. And you get some people that will go, frankly, waste medical resources because they've got this for things that. And you've got the opposite end of the spectrum where people don't ever go, and they're carrying massive amounts of burdens and pain. And then there's everything in between. And I think it's interesting. It kind of depends what you want, because sometimes I think doctors will, the advice is often stuff that we already know. Right. So, I'm at the larger end of the body mass scale. And so I know I need to be healthier. So I know that if I go to the doctor, there's going to be a ton of advice around that stuff. And so to a certain extent, it doesn't, it almost the role they're fulfilling has got nothing to do with their medical expertise. It is just the medical expertise gives them an authority over me to tell me something. It's an authority figure telling me something useful. So in that context, how much sleep they've had or had probably doesn't make any difference. On the other hand, you go to the opposite end of the thing where you go, this is a complex thing and I need them to think and I need them to fulfill a slightly different function, which is diagnose what's wrong. Well, then there's an interesting question, because I think even if one of the other things I've realized is that we have, we are, if we're not careful, you can go one of two ways in simple terms. You can have blind faith in everything the doctor says and recognize that, just they've got a title, they know what they're talking about. And there's plenty of examples where doctors have got things wrong. On the other hand, I don't want to be one of these people that turns in and is cynical about everything they say and assumes that automatically there's, they're biased or there's some agenda there or something. And so I think there's an interesting balancing act here, which is I would sort of say, look, I think they can still fulfill a useful function, even if even if they haven't fully slept, because I've done a job for many decades where I didn't always sleep properly. And so how can I turn around to myself and say, well, it's okay for me to do that, but not them. They're human as well. So I think I have all these mixed emotions. And what I think is interesting is I think we need to be intelligent about how we approach it and to recognize that they are humans doing the best that they can. And so we then have to say, well, how do I feel about what I was told? And if our gut instinct is that we're being told something that doesn't quite make sense, or we don't understand it, then I would say challenge it. But equally, don't shut off unpleasant news just because you don't want to hear it. Doesn't mean they're not also right. And I think this, we're entitled to a second opinion. I mean, if you look at any other context in life, you wouldn't, if something didn't go, you wouldn't go to get advice on, I don't know, plumbing from someone, and you sort of think that can't be right. Right? I'm going to go and check with someone else. And so I think to a certain extent, we should think in those terms as well. But recognizing that one of the things is the doctor is in theory, and I know some countries this isn't the case, isn't there to make money out of us. They're trying, but they've gone into that profession to try and do good. And so we start from the fact there's positive motive. There isn't, there's less of a conflict of interest than there might be if they were selling us a service where they'd make money from. And, and I recognize these are simplistic analyses. So that's kind of where I come out, Vishal, is that I think you can overthink this stuff, right? Because you'd never do anything. But I think it's interesting. And I think it's a really good example of sort of how, if we're not careful, our brains can be our best friends or our worst enemies. And we sometimes we don't know which is which. And sometimes our best friends are letting us do things we absolutely shouldn't. But equally, our worst enemies will stop us drawing conclusions. So that's probably a really unhelpful non-answer. But that's kind of the thoughts that are bouncing around in my head. And given the nature of the conversation we've had, I don't think I would want to give a firm answer either way. But with that said, let me throw it back at you and say, what are your thoughts on it?
I love that distinction which you made. I think it's quite helpful of simple versus a complex decision. If it's just a matter of a reminder of something which you should be doing and which is common knowledge and practice, I think it makes incredible amount of sense to put the fact that they're sleep deprived and maybe behaving like they've had a few drinks because of the impacts of sleep deprivation. So a drunk doctor in that case is fine. But maybe for a more complex decision, and maybe thinking about some of the work which designers do, which people in the space of tech, banking, as behavioral scientists that we do, they're quite often in the realm of complex decision making. We're trying to zoom out and understand the bigger picture. So in that case, I would think a drunk behavioral scientist, I definitely wouldn't trust. I'd want a behavioral scientist who takes time to pause and reflect, and a behavioral scientist who may one of the tools which I talk about in the book is the power of visualization, which I think is incredibly powerful. Something which I notice if I get that stressful email or if I'm feeling anxiety, I step away from my laptop, I go out, and I've read some of the neuroscience behind this about getting a panoramic vision. So just by looking into the horizon and softening the eye gaze, you kind of step out of the immediate urgency of the problem and you feel a sense of calm and relax. Um, and then when you get back into solving the challenge or solving the problem, you have this heightened sense of clarity, of focus, of also not assuming that it's the end of the world, that small little problem you have. So you're able to address that far better. So I do like that distinction. And maybe a drunk doctor for routine advice I would trust, but a drunk behavioral scientist, absolutely not.
Fabulous. What a great note on which to close things up. But before we do that, Vishal, I guess that I'm fascinated. Where do you go next? I mean, you're obviously you've got lots of work on. You've written the book. You're still having these sorts of conversations. The book will continue to be interesting to people. Hence, we're having the conversation. But what's next on the agenda for you?
Another book has always been in my mind. It's going to take me a few years to work towards. So I did start last week. So you can expect that in a few years. I'm really fascinated by this interconnection of neuroscience. Some of the things which we've been talking about. So neuroscience, behavioral science, and some of my own insights which have been surfacing from my practice of yoga and meditation. And I think there's a good intersection between these three disciplines, and I'm trying to further my thinking and my own learning in this space. Starting with self-experimentation, I do believe like if these tools can't work on yourself, they're pretty dumb, pretty blunt tools. You can fool some of the people some of the time. But I think to have a sustained impact on the world, you need to get a sense of how does this influence us? How do we feel when we use these tools? I think they're questions of ethics, they're questions of um, unprocessed emotions which surface. So I am working through this process of self experimentation to put out something else out there in the intersection of behavioral science, neuroscience, and yogic philosophy.
Amazing. Well, I'm looking forward to Tales from the Sauna, which will have the stories of the people that you've spoken to aggregated. I think that's your next setting. But Vishal, before that comes out, obviously, I want you to remind people what your book is called and tell them the obvious point about where they can get hold of it.
Sweet. Thanks, Christian. My book is called Money Mindsets. It's available on Amazon and some other bookstores. If you Google Money Mindsets and Vishal George, you may or may not find the book, depending on how I'm doing the search algorithms.
Well, I'll tell you what we'll do to facilitate that, because I know you're doing very well, is I'll also put links in the show notes to that and to the work that you do as well. So people can find that nice and easily. And the book, of course, comes highly recommended and starts with that wonderful story that you shared with us. So, Vishal, I want to say on a personal level, thank you so much. All the conversations I've always had with you have always been inspiring. You bring a different perspective, fresh perspective, with a real sense of humor, and that sense of humility, I think, is very, very strong in the way that you communicate and the work that you do. So I want to say thank you for that. But probably more importantly, right now, thank you for being a fabulous guest on the show.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you for having me and lovely conversation.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you. So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Vishal for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Vishal, his company Behavioural by Design, and his book Money Mindsets, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. You'll also find links to Diversify, the behavioural science practitioner network that he and I are both members of. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show website at humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, think about the stories you tell yourself about money and how you might change them, and thank you so much for listening.